And there we go. You're all set.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the class on the evolution of lace according to Vadoma. My name is Vadoma. I am registered as a matressa Miri Nader, but due to my persona, which is another long story, and we can go into that on another class, I do go by Vadoma as that's my family name, and since I consider everyone in the SCA to be my family, that's what you get to do. If you have to have a title, that's my other name. So, so today we're going to talk about the evolution of lace according to me. This is not the be-all, end-all of evolution of lace. It really is just kind of a survey of the different techniques, and as I study the techniques, how, at least to me, how it makes sense that things changed from one style to another, and how things progress to become more and more and more elaborate. Absolutely feel free to jump in and add any additional information that you have, any questions that you have, anything that you want to talk about. This is very much, I want this to be very much a collaborative discussion and not just a lecture. So whatever information that you have, feel free to add to the discussion. And with that, I will go ahead and let me make sure I've got the right stuff going, and I'll share my screen. Oh, you should be able to see the screen. And there are some class materials that I did send out that will be attached. This is, I'm just going to be pulling up the images from the class materials that we're looking at so that we can see them more up close than what than just showing the whole page. So you do have, let me see if I can, I'm just going to be moving things around. So back in the day, right, when fabric was invented, weaving started, things happened. I imagine that the ladies were sitting around, and men too, who knows, were sitting around darning fabric, right? They would get holes in fabric, they would need to darn them, they would need to fix them so that they could wear them whatever they were doing the next day. If you've ever darned fabric, and if you've ever looked at what is, like how that all works, and if you accidentally pull a thread too tight or mess up in the darning and what you're doing, you'll start seeing like little holes in your fabric, and you'll actually create holes. And to me, it just made sense that somebody said, oh, well, look, we can make decorative stitches if we pull the thread. So the pulled thread embroidery, to me, is one of the earliest forms of ways that we decorated fabric. And we created these different lace effects. Embroidery was added to it, but adding some of these textures that you can get with pulled thread embroidery really, to me, was just one of the very, very first early styles that we could get. And you can see that, if I can even make this a little bit larger, you can move my, you can see, so pulled thread is really the act of distorting the weft and the weave. That's not right. You guys can tell me what's right. It's distorting the weave of the fabric, right? It's pulling different threads together in such a way that it creates patterns and backgrounds and textures. And that's what pulled thread really is. So that's, there's a lot of really early styles of pulled thread. And a lot of textiles came out, and if you look at the Ashmolean Museum, there's a lot of textiles that came out of Egypt with this pulled thread styles. How many of you, we can just raise hands if you want to, how many of you have worked with pulled thread embroidery. I thought I could see that and get some interaction, but I can't, so we'll just move on. All right, so after pulled thread embroidery, hey, there's hands. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your feedback.
You had to find them.
Yeah, I found it, but I had to look on my other device. So pulled thread embroidery, it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of different styles that you can do for it, but it really is starts getting creative and allows you to do a lot of different styles. And I love the texture of pulled thread. What I like about this flask, which is it's Pilgrim's Flask, about the same time frame as the previous style. One of these days, this is on my bucket list, doing this cover for the linen bag for a flask. It really is one of those things that I want to do eventually. I don't know exactly. I wish that, you know, some of this embroidery that was in here would have survived so we could see what that pattern was. But I'm really glad that the other pieces worked. But this is more of, it's starting to go beyond pulled thread, and it's starting to have some drawn thread elements involved to it. So corners out here would be more pulled thread, but you can see this center. Let me make it a little bit bigger as well. You're starting to get into the drawn thread style where you're actually drawing threads out to create larger sections and bigger holes. And then these cute little fillers, which if you've ever, modernly, that little filler is known as a dove's eye. That's what that little stitch is. And so you're starting to see the beginnings of some of the drawn thread techniques and cutwork techniques that become prevalent later in our period in these pieces right here. I just love this piece. It really is one that I drill over. It's not that hard. It's not a difficult piece, but for some reason it just really catches my eye. Something that I want to recreate. So as we move from pulled thread into drawn thread, let's see what's on the next page. And there's a couple of different ways to do drawn thread. What we saw earlier was, you know, some drawn threads that are pulled in both directions. Early drawn thread embroidery is this style that was really common in linens, especially household linens. And if you see those paintings where they have a linen that stretches all the way across the table, and it really is just a thin, basically what we would call the table runner. But that was like their household napkins and their household covering. They weren't necessarily a tablecloth, but they were runners. They'd be used to clean your fingers and to set things on to keep the tables clean. A lot of those elements and those pieces have these drawn thread elements in them. And drawn thread elements are easy, especially in this format and this application of drawn thread, because you're just drawing out bands. So you take a length of linen and you just draw out the straight, you know, a single band. You might leave some linen in between the bands and then you draw out some more, especially on this one right here. You can see that, you know, you can see all the different bands, and they don't necessarily go on all four sides. They're just on one and maybe the other side at the very, very ends of drawn thread. And there is a class later today for drawn thread hems, which is part of this, but it is that's a later application where you're actually drawing threads on all four sides of the linen. So this is really interesting, and there's a lot of really fun, you can see it's very difficult to actually see what the patterns are when you start looking at these drawn thread pieces, especially in painting. But there's a lot of really, really clever feelings that we have now, especially in modern, which wouldn't be very much of a stretch to say that this is what they would have been. They were simple, just drawing the different clumps together, or the stitches together to create like posts, simple knots, which would have been picked up from anyone that was familiar with any type of a knitting knot. There's a lot of fillers for drawn thread that really look like fisherman's nets, which makes sense that that's something that would have been easily traceable to what was in period. And also some needle weaving, which we see a lot later in later lace styles, which would also be able to translate into make a lot of sense to say, yeah, we could make the argument that this was also a filler in period too. But this is the very beginning of drawn thread embroidery. Now, drawn thread, once you get a little bit later, here's some better examples where you can see this is a very simple band where you're just gathering up threads to make a post at the top, and then you're grabbing the alternating ones at the bottom to make this diamond filler, this zigzag. This is a really easy one. It's a fun one. I do this one a lot, especially on narrow bands when I'm doing some drawn thread work. I like this piece because you do get this idea of this larger band, and then of course the netted fringe work on the end, I think is just beautiful. And I do love this style of a filler. It's one I've also done, which is really, it works up very, very easy and quick. And that's one of the reasons I really like drawn thread, because it shows a beautiful edge, but it's not that difficult. So, and then as we get later, you get into what's called cut work embroidery, and pieces of cut work really are it's just an evolution of drawn thread, because you're looking at, well, if we can do drawn thread across one end, what happens if we start drawing thread up the other end or in the middle, or we start doing different ways of doing drawn thread. And then you evolve from drawn thread into, well, what if we just actually cut holes in the fabric and started wrapping those threads and securing those threads, much like what we did with drawn thread, but instead of just following very linear straight bands, but we actually start making maybe a stair step design, or we go like I said, all the way across on all four ends, or something like that. So the evolution really came from, hey, we can pull our threads together to create these different kind of background textures. And then if we, pull them even more, we can make bigger holes. And then if we just completely draw threads out, we can make bigger sections for more elaborate designs. And now we're drawing threads in both directions so that we can actually include, bigger, more elaborate fillings, put a different shape around what we're doing with those cut work, and just different ideas on this one. This one it looks a lot like that flask that we looked at earlier. There's a lot more of the regular embroidery involved, but you can see this section in here would be a pulled thread section. This is some surface embroidery, and then you get to this beautiful cut work that's around the edges that you can see. Again, this is that little dove's eye filler stitch. Everything else is just some wrapped bars. These would be figure 8 bars, and then just the wrapped bars around the outside to anchor those cut threads in place so that they didn't unravel. Some more pulled threads. Some pulled thread, you can see this pulled thread in the border, just enhancing what's already there with the surface embroidery, and enhancing that, just giving that a texture, which I just love. One of my favorite things about embroidery really is, how do I create different textures to not necessarily add color to a piece, but definitely to add just a different feel and break up a little bit. So I love this piece as well. It's not high on my bucket list like the flask is, but it's definitely it's a beautiful, just a fun example of a piece that we can look at um, pulling that out, you can see all the different textures. So now we're getting into cut work and how cut work works. And there's a lot of different styles of cut work. And cut work really is, I consider it a lace style. I really do, just because of the intricacy that you can get with the lace and how it's working. And, you know, I mean, you can get some very, very elaborate styles with cut work. So if you want to call it, you know, pre-lace, whatever it is that you want to call it, whatever you do, but I just think it's a lace style. So one of the most common styles of cut work is Hardanger. And if you've looked at Hardanger, there's a lot of arguments as to whether Hardanger is period or not. And if you want to have that discussion, I would love to have that discussion with you. There's a lot of, just because it wasn't discovered by the Europeans until early 17th century doesn't mean it didn't exist before then. And also when you compare the process of how Hardanger is made, it's much more related to the Middle Eastern embroideries than it is with the Italian embroidery, which seems to be the current discussion for this style of embroidery, that it's a descendant of the Italian reticella. And it's really, I mean, I haven't been able to prove it. If you want to have the discussion offline, I'd love to have that discussion with you. But in studying the processes and studying the motifs, in studying how the trade routes, it's a precursor. It's not a child of. I think it's a precursor of the Italian.
Vadoma,
So, yes.
we have a question in the chat. Do you
Okay,
want to do that now or wait for later?
That's fine. What's the question?
The question we've got is, with drawn thread techniques, is it done when the material is being made on the loom, or is it done so it can be done after the fact? For example, could I take a piece of linen or other material and create some drawn thread patterns in it?
Absolutely, I do that all the time. So I make drawn thread towels on a regular basis, and they're 18 inches wide. So the beauty of drawn thread is you can make them on any existing fabric. Any linen is easiest, just because it's easiest to draw those threads out. But absolutely after the fact, it's not done on the loom. And then you get to choose what that looks like and where you place your bands and how, and you know, how wide or how narrow, so that you can also manipulate the fillers as well. So let's go back to looking at these drawn threads. So you can see these edges are a little bit easier. So you actually literally draw all the threads out, these warp threads, and then you have, well, your weft threads, sorry. You draw these weft threads out, and then your warp threads are still existing, and that's what these edges are, is the existing warp threads. And that's what you do your designs on, is those warp threads. So you're absolutely taking an existing piece of linen, which would be my recommendation, and drawing these threads out and then creating your designs on the inside. Does that answer your question? I can't see people nod, so I hope so.
Yes, that answers my question. I do have a follow-up question. How do you control, like if I want to make a drawn thread cut in a fabric, but I don't want it to go across the whole cut, I just want like a center piece. How do you control it from
Yeah.
that?
You come to the drawn thread embroidery class that's next hour.
Well, I'll be there.
Yes, come to the drawn class. So,
Okay.
really what you're doing, and I'll just explain it really quick. You're just doing an overcast stitch on your threads to anchor them in place. That's what you do. And that's what you do with your cut work. That's what you do with lace. That's what you do with everything. Any exposed thread that you have to wrap them to anchor them to make it so that they don't unravel. Does that
Thank you very much. Yes.
Easy ways to do technique, but unfortunately I can't get into that today. So here's some more Hardanger. I love Hardanger. Hardanger is how I got started with cut work. It's going to be near and dear to my heart until I die. I've done several Hardanger pieces, and then, you know, with the argument of whether Hardinger's period or not, I moved to another style of cut work that is just as near and dear to my heart, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this is very, very typical of Hardanger. You have these what's called plaster blocks that anchor. So this is the anchor to your threads. This is going back to the previous question that we had. So these threads are cut out, and these plaster blocks, which is wrap stitching. Let me see if I can get any closer. It's wrapping. It's pixelated, but that at least gives you a close-up view. You can see that it's wrapping those threads to anchor those in place. And that's what is, so this is very typical of Hardanger. It's very geometrical. It has satin stitch elements in the middle. It has all these beautiful, beautiful fillers, but it's very diamond-y shape, I guess, that's the best way to call it, because that's what you get. That's the specific style. So this is a very simple style of cut work. You stitch your plaster blocks before you do your cutting. So you're able to control, and you have kind of a measurement of where you're cutting. It's absolutely counted. It's very, very rigid in that all of these blocks are some division of 4. So these are anchoring 4 threads. These would be anchoring 8 threads. You can get some where you're anchoring 12 threads, but it's very, very strict in its process. This is a 4-sided stitch, which is a pulled thread stitch. But this would be Hardanger. And then when I found out, you know, all the kerfuffle over Hardanger, and that it was or was not period, I went searching for something that was very similar to it, or something that I knew I could do, and I learned about left parallel lace, which is now my absolute favorite style. It's a little bit nerve-wracking because you actually cut, and so you can see, in answer to the previous question, you can see how these threads have been removed, and see how this is kind of in process right here, where they haven't wrapped those stitches yet. So this is where you're going to get your, this is where you see that you need to still wrap those threads and anchor them into place so that everything doesn't just unravel on you. So this is a good example of what we were talking about earlier. Left parallel lace it looks a lot like Hardanger. It follows a lot of the same, at least the same shapes. The process, like I said, is completely different. It's measured, it's not counted. Originally it was made by commission. So so they had to fill a specific size. And so they would measure the pattern on, instead of counting it. So the pattern would come out to be a very, very specific size. And like I said, it's cut before it's wrapped. So you have to manage this wrapping after the fact. It's made in hand on a pillow, which is really interesting. And it uses a lot of, you know, you have your satin stitches, you have your scroll stitching, you have your 4-sided stitch. Even though it's a different style of 4-sided stitch, you get the same type of a format and everything. So you can see that this is a very simple style of cut work. Like I said, it's Hardanger. It comes from Norway. It comes from a very remote part of Norway. And so it doesn't have a lot of outside influence. They kind of made this on their own. Left Para has a fun history. All the ladies from Italy would pack up their reticella bags and come down to Cyprus on vacation. And the ladies of Cyprus decided that they liked it and they could do it better. And so they created their own style. So this is, left parallel lace is very, very, it's specific to Cyprus. It's still only made on Cyprus. Unless you're crazy like me and make it, and you have to teach yourself because it's very much a trade on on the island of Cyprus. This is what it looks like. So you can see it's a lot more complex. There's a lot more elements involved. It's a lot, it's fancier. So we're starting to progress into more of a fancy piece. Any questions on cut work before I move to either of those styles of cut work before I move on to Italian cut work? Because Italian people really are where we get into the beautiful lace pieces. Those Italians, they needed everything. So Italian cut work, you can trace evolution through museum pieces there as well. So they started with these cut work, which would just have pieces that are cut work, sections that are cut out, and again, anchored, wrapped, and then they start getting more and more and more complex. So then you start getting into pieces like this that have sections that are cut out, and then banded by other types of lace or drawn work or things like that. So you're starting to see a lot more combination of laces, combination of styles of embroidery to create these beautiful, beautiful pieces. This is actually needle weaving down here with, this would be drawn thread with needle weaving here, and then just these corner sections to fill in these spaces as well. So this is drawn thread. This would be a drawn thread style. This is also some drawn thread style as you're looking at actually more of a cut work to get that shape. To get those more cut work as we start coming down. You can see, more still the same style of stitches. We're starting to see a lot of the same thing. So once they started looking at these pieces and they started doing drawn thread, well, my thought would have been, well, if you can draw out a simple band that's 1 or 2 inches, why can't you draw out something that's 5 or 6 inches and start getting more complex pieces and complex designs? And that's what we start getting into here. And from here, we're starting to move into what's considered reticella cut work. Not the for me, there's 2 styles of reticella. There's reticella lace, and there's reticella cut work, more cut work style. So this is where you're actually drawing out the threads or creating specific sections and filling it with those beautiful, beautiful reticella designs that we have. Reticella is very grid-like. You can always see a grid in reticella and what you're looking at. So as you look at, these squares, that's very indicative to that style of reticella, of lace or cut work, however you want to define it. So here's some more.
Another question.
Yes.
So like in the Italian and other the Renaissance dresses, the Elizabethan style dresses with the tall lace collars, would that have been cut work or draw work, or would that have been more the knotted lacing?
Yeah, we're going to get into that. That's more of the punto in aria style, which are considered, punto in aria is, an air basically. So we'll get into that next. That's what I would consider kind of the final evolution of that. Good question. Thank you. So this is still just some more of that drawn thread cut work style, where you're looking at different shapes, you're looking at different styles, you're putting them on the diagonal. You can see it has this stair step design still, and then it's filling in these corners of the triangles are filled in with some detached buttonhole. Something that's similar to a dove's eye, but these are a little bit bigger. So these are actually wrap bars in the middle, but it still has that same kind of a look and feel as what the previous dove's eyes were. And And so this is just continued evolving. They just got more and more and more elaborate as you look at that. So this is more what you were asking about, is that correct? I don't know who's asking those questions, but I think this is more what you're looking for. So this is, so the next evolution of lace, after they did a bunch of cut work and started filling in these massively elaborate designs that were usually on, you know, on this grid style, the next evolution was to say, well, why do we even have to start with the groundwork? Why can't we just create our own? Because we are working with lace. And so this is when you get into, again, I define this as reticello lace. Other people will define it as something a little bit, but it still has this very, very boxy grid-like design in it, and which makes it really easy to chart out and to actually do. You're still, but instead now of having a ground fabric and drawing threads, now you're actually creating, you actually create the grid in what you're doing. So you'll end up with, you'll put down some ground fabrics, you'll anchor them in place, and then you do these bigger bars would be a figure-8 stitch to fill those in, and then these smaller bars that are in here are a wrap bar and some buttonhole stitches. And we actually have a class a little bit later today to talk about how to dissect patterns and to know which stitches go where. So come back in a couple of hours and you can take a look at that. But this is really where we start getting into a lot of the lace that you see in the later period portraits, those beautiful rough collars, pieces around like your cuffs, different like edges on handkerchiefs. These are called like points. All of those pieces, different elements on aprons. This is when you start getting into the lace that would have been included on those pieces that you see in the portraits. So this is when you start creating what I said, what is classified as punto-in-aria or lace in air, or points in air, where you're no longer starting from a ground fabric, but you're basically starting with a pattern and some thread, and this is 100% built by the person. And then you can get, they become even more elaborate with the beautiful figures, which I have no desire to figure these out, but I do know people that do them and they're stunning when you do them in person. But these are done with the different buttonhole stitches and other stitches to get these different, again, textures are what really add beauty to these pieces. So you're not just looking at the thing over and over, but different styles of stitches give you different textures, which are a lot of fun. And then it translates into what would be considered, I don't know if there's a lot of different names for it, but it's lace that attaches to different types of capes or pieces that look like cape. This is much later style embroidery and later style lace, and there's, like I said, there's a lot of different names for it. But instead of creating a ground where you're creating, these different sections and then putting needle lace edging on the ends of it, you start with the cape, and you connecting your capes together in different styles and putting fillers in between your styles. And that, I think, is the bottom of my presentation. And so there's actually the next class in the lace track is going to go over patterns, and I'm hoping that we're seeing a lot more of different styles of patterns that are available. Perhaps can speak more to that. And then after that, we have, like I mentioned, we have a class to talk about how to decipher the classes, how to decipher the patterns and know which stitch goes where. So this is just a quick introduction. Like I said, it's lace according to me and no one else. But do you have any questions?
Wow, this is kind of overwhelming, but it's awesome. Thank you.
So it was asked in
Well,
chat
it's
how to distinguish between reticella cut work and the reticella lace.
really, reticella cut work is attached to fabric. It really is, it would be an insert, considered like an inset. Look, I can pull up chat so I can see things now. Yes, it's my, hold on, let me, do I not have my email? Sorry for there's my email right here. So yeah, the reticella cut work is really, so my definition of reticella, like I said, this is just according to me, is very much that grid like reticella. Once you get into other styles of embroidery, it has a bunch of different names. So you can find reticella as a drawn thread version, or it's basically an inset. And that to me is cut work, or you're actually cutting a hole in the fabric to be able to do that. And then the lace would be the style where you're creating your own grid, and you're not starting from linen that's available. You're creating your own grid and going from there. So you're creating it basically the same. All right. Any other questions? And did everybody get I'll type my email address in the chat as well if you didn't catch it off. It is on the class materials as well. Feel free to reach out to me anytime. I love lace, I love cut work. I will say this, let me give you this parting words about lace, or not so parting if you want to keep asking questions. So like I said, I really got started with hard as a cut work style about 26 years ago. I'm trying to think, because I made harding or trim for my daughter's christening dress. So I'm trying to think how old she is. So that's where I started with cut work, and it's just kind of evolved into different styles of cut work, and pulled thread and drawn work is really, really where my, which is really, really where my heart lies when it comes to this embroidery. I love the white on white styles. And anytime I get to cut a hole in a piece of fabric and then fill it with a beautiful design, like that's just what makes my soul happy. So as a natural evolution to that, I thought, well, let me try the actual lace work where I'm creating lace from a foundation in the Punto Anario or the reticella lace work style. And I have tried and tried and tried and tried. And I've done several pieces. It's not that I don't know how to do it. My heart just isn't in it. It really just isn't there. And I had a heart with one of my lace mentors a year ago, and I was like, I keep trying and I just can't love it. And she's like, well, why do you keep trying? And so I was explaining, well, it's because I feel like I need to this or this or this. And she was just laughing at me. She's like, just do what you love. There's no reason for you to force yourself to do something that you don't love. She goes, the things that you do, I don't like to do. So you do those things and I'll do these things, and then we'll swap and we'll, create a barter system. And isn't the barter system fantastic? And isn't that what it's set up for? So that people can do what they like and still get other things based on what they're, somebody else's, sorry, my son just walked by. Say goodbye. So it really is, for us to do what you want. So if you're looking at any of these styles of embroidery, if you look up pulled thread, drawn thread, any style of the cut work, any of the lace work, and you find something that you absolutely love, do it and do lots of it and do more of it. if you find something that you kind of like and want to get better at, go for that. But if you're like me and you just are like, I've tried it several times, I just don't love it, then don't do it. There's nothing forcing you to like love and do one style of embroidery over another style of these. All of them, I think all of them are beautiful, and I love them all. And I'm very, very impressed with people that can do all the really fancy laces, and I'll let them do the fancy laces, and I'll just turn out drawn thread pals and be happy with it. So don't be afraid to pick what you love and stick with it. But don't be afraid to try things new either. Make sure you really like them or don't like them. Any other questions? All right. All right, Prax, do we have a sign-in sheet for this class? How do I need to capture our attendees?
I'm working on that right now. I'll have it over in the chat in just a second. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Thank you, Prax.
You said sustenances. So I brought you sustenances.
Vadoma, I've got to go run and get ready for my class. Can you make sure I get on the sign-in sheet, please?
Sure.
Thank you, darling.
You're welcome.